Read one more chapter, read chapter 8, and then we'll only have one to do tomorrow. Getting roasty toasty in here, and I can't breathe in here. Chapter 8. For a week or two, the great many people came to the gallery, but even with Lewis as interpreter, and the pictures failed to make themselves heard. During the first days, indeed, owing to the unprecedented idea of holding paid exhibit at a private home, and to the mockery of the newspapers, the gallery of Christian art was thronged with noisy curiosity seekers. Once the astonished metropolitan police had to be invited to calm their comments and control their movements, but the name of Christian art soon chilled this class of sightseers, and before long they were replaced by dumb, respectable throng who roamed vacantly through the rooms and out again, grumbling that it wasn't worth the money. Then these two diminished, and once the tide had turned, the ebb was rapid. Every day from 2 to 4, Lewis sat still sat shivering among his treasures, or patiently measured the length of the deserted gallery as long as there was a chance of anyone coming. He would not admit that he was beaten, for the next visitor might always be the one who understood. One snowy February day he had thus placed the rooms in paced the room in unbroken solitude for above an hour. When a carriage wheel stopped at the door, he hesitated to open it. In a great noise of silks, his sister Sarah Ann Hazard entered. Lewis felt for a moment, as he used to under his father's glance. Marriage and millions had given the moon-faced Sarah something of a racy awfulness. But her brother looked into her empty eyes, and his own kept their level. "Well, Lewis," said Mrs. Hazard, with a simpering sternness that caught her breath. "Well, Sarah Ann, I'm happy that you've come to take a look at my pictures. I've come to see you and your wife." She gave another nervous gasp, shook out her flounces, and added in a rush, "and to ask you how much longer this spectacle is to continue." Ha ha! She's acting like the father. "Well, there has been a considerable falling out lately in the number of visitors." "Thanks heavens," she interjected. "But as long as I feel that anyone wishes to come, I shall be here to open the door, as you see." She sent a shuddering glance about her. "Lewis, I wonder if you realize—" "Oh, fully." "Then why do you go on? Isn't it enough? Aren't you satisfied with the effort they have produced? With the effort you have produced? On your family and on the whole of New York? With the slur on poor Papa's memory?" "Papa left me the pictures, Sarah Ann." "Yes, but not to make yourself a mountebank about them." Lewis considered impatiently. "Are you sure? Perhaps, on the contrary, he did it for that very reason." "Oh, don't heap more insults on your father's memory. Things are bad enough without that. How your wife can allow it, I can't see. Do you ever consider the humiliation to her? Lewis gave another dry smile. She's used to being humiliated. The Kents accustom her to that. Sarah Ann reddened. I don't know why I should stay to be spoken to in this way, but I came with my husband's approval. Do you need that to come and see your brother? Yes, 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 yes. My sister, my blood sister, needed the permission of my older half-sister to come and tell me she was sorry. Good, I was afraid that Sophie had turned off the mic. Yep. Families are the worst people in the world to their ones that they call brothers and sisters. I need it to make the offer I'm about to make, and wish he authorized. Lewis looked at her in surprise, and she purpled up to the lace ruffles. Sophie, please go away. This is good stuff, and you're ruining it. No, I'm busy. Lewis looked at her in surprise, and she purpled up to the lace ruffles inside her satin bonnet. Have you come to make an offer for my collection? He asked her humorously. You seem to take pleasure in insinuating preposterous things, but anything is better than this public sight on our name. Slight. Again, she ran a shuddering glance over the pictures. John and I, she announced, are prepared to double the allowance Mother left you on condition that this ends for good. That horrible sign is taken down tonight. Lewis seemed mildly to weigh the proposal. Thank you very much, Sarah Ann, he said at length. I'm touched and surprised that you and John should have made this offer, but perhaps before I decline it, you accept mine simply to show you my pictures. When once you've looked at them, I think you'll understand. Mrs. Hassan drew back hesitantly. Her air imagined she collapsed. Look at the pictures? Oh, thank you. But I can see they are well from here. Very well from here. And besides, I don't pretend to be a judge. Then come up and see Raycie and the baby, Lewis said quietly. She stared at him, embarrassed. Oh, thank you, she stammered again. And as she prepared to follow him, then it's really no, Lewis. Do consider, my dear. You say yourself that hardly anyone comes. What harm can there be in closing the place? What? When tomorrow a man may come who understands? Mrs. Hassan tossed her plumes desperately and followed him in silence. What, Mary Adele? She exclaimed, pausing abruptly on the threshold of the nursery. Raycie, as usual, sat holding her babe by the fire, and from a low seat opposite her rose a lady in richly furred, as feathered as Mrs. Hassan, but with far less assurance, and carried off her fur blows. Mrs. Kent ran to Lewis and laid her plump cheeks against his, while Raycie greeted Sarah Ann. I had no idea who I had no idea you were here, Mary Adele. Mary Adele was the one who went to Mrs. Pope when she was in desperate needs. I just dropped in for a minute, she continued, to see that darling little pet of an angel child. And she enveloped the astonished baby in her ample rustlings and flutterings. I'm very glad to see you here, Sarah Ann, Mary Adele answered with simplicity, and it's not for want of wishing that I hadn't come before. Trishy knows that, I know. But the cares of a household like mine, she is so full of herself. Yes, it has been so difficult to get about in bad weather, Trishy suggested sympathetically. Mrs. Hassad lifted the racy eyebrows. Has it really? With 2 pairs of horses, one hardly notices the weather. Oh, the pretty, pretty, pretty baby, Mary Adeline. Sarah Ann continued, turning severely to her sister. I shall be happy to offer you a seat in my carriage if you are thinking of leaving. But Mary Adele was a married woman too. She raised her mild head, and she glanced across to her sister quietly. My own carriage is at the door, thank you kindly, Sarah Ann, she said, and the baffled Sarah Ann withdrew on Lewis's arms. But a moment later, the old habit of subordination reasserted herself. Mary Adele, gently countenance, grew as timorous as a child's, and she gathered up her cloaks in haste. Perhaps I was too quick. I'm sure she meant it kindly, she exclaimed, overtaking Lewis as he turned to come up the stairs. With a smile, he stood watching 2 sisters drive off together in the Hassad coach. He returned to the nursery where Treshy was still crooning over her daughter. Well, my dear, he said, what do you suppose Sarah Ann came for? And in reply to her wondrous gaze, to buy me off from showing the pictures. His wife's indignation took just the form he could have wished. She simply went on with her rich cooing laugh and hugging the baby tighter. But Lewis felt the perverse desire to lay a still greater strain upon her loyalty. Offer double my allowance, and John, if only I take down the sign. No one shall touch the sign, Tracy flamed. Not till I do, said her husband grimly. She turned about and scanned him with anxious eyes. Lewis, you... Oh, my dear, they're right. I can't go on forever. He went up to her and put his arms about her and the child. You've been braver than an army of heroes, but it won't do. The expenses have been a good deal heavier than I was led to expect, and I can't raise a mortgage on pictures. Nobody will touch them. She meant this quickly. No, I know. That was what Mary Adele came about. The blood rushed angrily to Lewis's temples. Mary Adele? How the devil did she hear about it? Through Mr. Reedy, I suppose. But you must not be angry. She was kind herself. She doesn't want you to close the gallery, Lewis. That is, not as long as you really continue to believe in it. She and Donald Kent will lend us enough to go on for a year longer. That is what she came to say. For the first time since the struggle had begun, Louis Raycie's throat was choked with tears. His faithful Mary Adele, he had sudden vision of her stealing out of the house at a high point before daylight, carrying a basket of scraps for poor Mrs. Edgar Poe, who was dying of a decline down the lane, and he laughed aloud in his joy. Dear old Mary Adeline. It seems like older pages are always thicker than others. How magnificent of her. Enough to give me a whole year more. He pressed his wet cheeks against his wife in a long silence. Well, dear, he said at length, it's for you to say, do we accept? He held her off questionably, at arm's length, and her wan little smile met his over the mingled with it. Of course we accept. This is the last chapter. We're going to read it now, and then when it loads, we can post. Of Raycie's family, which prevailed so powerful in New York in the 40s. Only one of the names survived in my boyhood, half a century later. Like so many descendants of a proud little colony society, the Raycies had totally vanished, forgotten by everyone but a few old ladies, one or two genealogists, and a sexton of the Trinity Church who kept the records of their graves. The Raycies' blood was, of course, still to be traced in various allied families, the Kents and the Hassads, the Cosbys, many others proud to claim cousinships with a signer, but already indifferent or incurious as to the fate of his protege. These old New Yorkers who lived so well and spent their money so liberally vanished like the pinch of dust when they disappeared from their pews and their dining tables. If I had to have been familiar with the name since my youth, it is chiefly because its one survivor was a distant cousin of my mother's, whom sometimes took me to see on days that she thought I was likely to be good, because I had been promised a treat for the morrow. Old Miss Elitha Raycie lived in a house I had always heard spoken of as Cousin Ebenezer's. It had eventually, in its day, been an admired specimen of domestic architecture, but was now regarded as a hideous though venerable relic of bygone age. Mrs. Raycie, being crippled with rheumatism, sat above stairs in a large cold room, meagerly furnished with beadwork tables, rosewood, with the thingamajigger on top, Tage, with another thingamajigger on top, Res, and the portraits of pale, sad-looking people in old clothes. She herself was large and satyrian, with a battlemental black lace cap, and so deaf that she seemed a survival of forgotten days, a Rosetta Stone to which the cue was lost. Even to my mother, nursed in that vanished tradition, and knowing instinctively to whom Miss Raycie alluded when she spoke of Mary Adele and Sarah Ann and Uncle Doctor. Intercourse with was difficult. That means to talk to, not have sex. Languishing and my juvenile interruptions were often encouraged, then reproved. In the course of one of these visits, my eye listily roamed, singled out among the palette portraits of 3 crayon drawings of a little girl with large forehead, dark eyes, dressed in a pale frock and embroidered pantaloons, and sitting on a grass bank. I pulled my mother's sleeve. To ask who it was, and my mother answered, that was poor little Louisa Raycie, who died of a decline. How old was little Louisa when she died, Cousin Alethea? To battered this simple question into Cousin Alethea's brain was an affair of 10 laborious minutes, and when the job was done and Miss Racine, with an air of mysterious displeasure, had dropped a deep 11. My mother was too exhausted to continue. So she turned to me and to add, with one of the private smiles we kept for each other, it was the poor child who would have inherited the Raycie gallery. But to a little boy of my age, this item of information lacked interest, nor did I understand my mother's surreptitious amusement. This far-off scene suddenly came back to me last year when, on one of my infrequent visits to New York, I went to dine with an old friend, a banker, John Selwyn, and came to an astonished stand before the mantelpiece in his new library. "Hello," I said, looking up at the picture above the chimney. My host squared his shoulders and thrust his hands into his pocket and affected the air of modesty with which people think it proper to assume when their positions are admired. The Macarena di Alba. Yes, it was the only thing I managed to capture out of the Raycie collection. The only thing? Well, but you should have seen the Mantegna and the Giotto and the Pira di Francia. Hang it. One of the most beautiful Pira del Francias in the world, a girl in profile, with her hair in a pearl net, against the background of columbines that went back to Europe. National Gallery, I believe, and the Carapazzi, and the most exquisite little St. George that went to California. Lord, he sat down with the sigh of a hungry man turning away from the groaning board. "Well, it nearly broke me in buying this," he muttered, as if at least that fact were some consolation. I was turning over my early memories in quest of a clue to what he spoke of as the Raycie collection, in a tone which implied that he was allergic to objects familiar to all art lovers. Suddenly there weren't poor little Louisa picture by any chance. I asked, remembering my mother's cryptic smile. Sedgwick looked at me perplexedly. "Who the deuce is poor little Louisa?" And without waiting for my answer, he went on. "They were no fool, Netta. They were that fool, Netta, Crosby, until a year ago, and she never ever knew it." We looked at each other interrogatively, my friend perplexed at my ignorance, and I, now absorbed in trying to run down the genealogical of Nettie Crosby. I did so finally. Nettie Crosby, don't mean Nettie Kent, the one who married Jim Cosby. That's it. They were cousins of the Raycies, and she inherited the pictures. I continued to ponder. I wanted awfully to marry her, and yet I left Harvard, I said presently, more to myself than to the hearer. Well, if you had, you'd have annexed a prize full and one of the most beautiful collections of Italian primitives in the world. In the world! Will you wait till you see them, if you haven't already? And I seem to make out that you haven't, that you can't have. How long have you been in Japan? 4 years? I thought so. Well, it was only last winter that Nettie found out. Found out what? What there was in old Althea Raycie's attic. You must remember the old Miss Raycie, who lived in that hideous house on 10th Street when we were children. She was a cousin of your mother's, wasn't she? Well, the old fool lived there for nearly half a century with 5 millions worth of pictures shut up in the attic over her head. It seemed they'd been there ever since the death of a poor young Raycie who collected them in Italy years and years ago. I don't know much about the story. I never was strong on genealogically, and Raycie have always been rather dim to me. They were everyone's cousin, of course, but as far as one can make out, that seems to have been their principal, if not their only function. Oh, I suppose the Raycie building was called after them, only they didn't build it. But there was this one young fella. I wish I could find out more about him. All that Nettie seemed to know, or to care for that matter, is that when he was very young, barely out of college, he was sent to Italy by his father to buy old masters in the 40s. It must have been, and came back with this unbelievable collection of boy of that age, and was disinherited by the old gentleman for bringing home such rubbish. The young fellow and his wife died ever so many years ago, both of them. It seemed he was so laughed at for buying such pictures that they went away and lived like hermits in the depths of the country. And there were some funny spectral portraits of them that old Althea had up in her bedroom. Nettie showed me one of them the last time I went to see her, a pathetic drawing of an only child, and a manic little girl with a big forehead. Joe, that must have been your little Louisa. I nodded. In a plaid frock, embroidered pantaloons, yes, something of the sort. Well, when Louisa and her parents died, I suppose the picture went to old Miss Raycie. At any rate, at some time or other, and it must have been longer ago than you or I can remember, and the old lady inherited them with the 10th Street house. And when she died 3 or 4 years ago, her relatives found she'd never even been upstairs to look at them. Well, she died interstate, and intestate, and Nettie Crosby, turned out to be the next kin. There wasn't much to be got out of the estate, or so they thought, and as the Cosbys are always hard up, the house at 10th Street had been sold, and the pictures were very nearly sent off to the auction room with all the rest of the stuff, but nobody supposed they would bring anything, and the auctioneer said that if you tried to sell pictures with carpets and bedding and kitchen furniture, it always depreciates the whole thing. And so as the Cosbys had some bare walls to cover, they sent for the lot. There were about 30, and decided to have them cleaned and hung them up. After all, Nettie said, as well as I can make out through the cobwebs, some of them looked like rather jolly copies of early Italian things. But as she was short of cash, she decided to clean them at home instead. What are you doing? You're not getting in there. Nobody's getting in there. You're not getting in there. You're leaving the room, Miss Sadie, Miss Sophie. Sophie is a bossy. Yes, Sophie is bossy. That's Bird. Miss Pretty Bird. Mr. Pretty Bird. Well, I have a cat named Molly, so why can't a bird be called Pretty and be a boy? Just a second, Sophie. I'll get it open. I have to reach with my bad arm. Hang on. Hang on. There. Now you can go. Jump over there. No, Molly. Hurry up. Jump. Go on. Go. Oh, no. We're leaving a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry, baby. Got Molly's arm. Didn't mean to do that. Okay. And one day, while she was operating on this very one before you, with her sleeves rolled up, a man called, who always does call on such occasions, the man who knows. In the given case of it was a quiet fellow connected with the Louvre who bought her a letter from Paris and whom she'd invited to one of her stupid dinners. He was announced, and she thought it would be a joke to let him see what she was doing. She has pretty arms, you may remember. So he was asked into the dining room, where he found her with a pail of hot water and soap suds, and this laid out on the table, and the first thing he did was to grab her pretty arm so tight that it was black and blue, while he shouted at her, "God in heaven, not hot water!" My friend leaned back with a sigh of mingled resentment and satisfaction, and we sat silently looking up at the lovely adoration above the mantelpiece. That's how I got a little cheaper. Most of the old varnish was gone for good, but luckily For her, it was the first picture she had attacked. And as for the others, you must see them.